Sarah Martinez had always been the type of person who could light up a room with her smile. Growing up in a small Texas town, she was the girl everyone knew would do something important with her life. Her teachers praised her dedication, her friends admired her determination, and her family beamed with pride when she announced her decision to join the military at 18. The young woman who walked through the gates of basic training was confident and eager. Sarah had dreams of serving her country, of making a difference in the world, and of proving that a girl from nowhere could rise to great heights. Her drill sergeants quickly noticed her natural leadership abilities, and her fellow recruits looked up to her unwavering spirit during the toughest training exercises. Everything changed on a routine training mission during her second year of service. Sarah's unit was practicing urban warfare tactics in a simulated combat zone when an unexpected equipment malfunction sent a piece of metal flying through the air. The jagged fragment struck her face with devastating force, tearing through her left cheek and leaving a deep, irregular wound that would forever alter her appearance. The days following the accident were a blur of hospital rooms, surgical procedures, and worried faces of family and friends. Despite the best efforts of military doctors, the scar that formed was prominent and impossible to hide. It ran from just below her left eye down to the corner of her mouth, creating a permanent reminder of that terrible day. When Sarah looked in the mirror for the first time after the bandages were removed, she barely recognized herself. The confident young woman who had entered the military seemed like a stranger now. The scar dominated her reflection, and she found herself unable to look away from the angry red line that had replaced her smooth skin. Her recovery period was filled with well-meaning visitors who tried to offer comfort. Family members assured her that the scar didn't define her. Friends insisted she was still beautiful, and fellow soldiers reminded her that she was lucky to be alive. But their words felt hollow to Sarah, who could see the way people's eyes inevitably drifted to her face when they spoke to her. The psychological impact of her injury proved more challenging than the physical healing. Sarah, who had once faced every challenge head-on, now found herself avoiding mirrors and making excuses to skip social gatherings. The woman who had dreamed of leading troops into battle couldn't even bear to lead a conversation without feeling self-conscious about her appearance. Military counselors worked with her extensively, helping her process the trauma and adjust to her new reality. They explained that her feelings were normal, and that many service members struggled with visible injuries, but Sarah felt isolated in her experience, convinced that no one could truly understand what it was like to carry such an obvious mark of vulnerability. As her medical leave drew to an end, Sarah faced a difficult decision about her future in the military. Part of her wanted to return to active duty and prove that she could still serve effectively despite her injury. Another part of her wondered if she would ever feel comfortable in uniform again, knowing that her scar would always draw attention and questions from those around her. The night before she was scheduled to return to base, Sarah sat alone in her childhood bedroom, staring at old photographs of herself in uniform. The smiling young woman in those pictures seemed like someone from another lifetime. She wondered if that confident person still existed somewhere beneath the scar, or if the accident had changed her forever in ways that went far deeper than her physical appearance. The morning Sarah returned to active duty, she spent nearly an hour getting ready in her small apartment off base. She had developed a routine of carefully applying makeup to minimize the appearance of her scar, though she knew it could never fully hide the damage. Her hands shook slightly as she adjusted her uniform, checking and rechecking her appearance in the mirror. Walking through the base gates felt like entering a foreign world, even though she had called this place home for years. Every person she passed seemed to stare, though she couldn't be sure if their glances were real or imagined. Sarah kept her head down and made her way quickly to the administrative building, where she would receive her new assignment. Her commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Williams, greeted her with professional courtesy, but Sarah noticed the brief moment when his eyes registered her scar. That fleeting look of surprise and perhaps pity was something she would come to know well in the weeks that followed. Despite his efforts to treat her normally, Sarah could sense the change in how others perceived her. The assignment she received was desk duty in the logistics department, far removed from the active fieldwork she had once excelled at. When Sarah questioned whether this was related to her injury, she was told it was simply where they needed her most, but she suspected the truth was more complicated than that. The military, despite its progressive policies, still struggled with how to handle soldiers whose injuries made others uncomfortable. Sarah's first few weeks back were a constant battle against her own insecurities. During meetings, she found herself positioning her body to keep the scarred side of her face turned away from others. She volunteered for tasks that would keep her isolated in her office, avoiding the common areas where soldiers gathered to socialize. The confident leader she had once been seemed to have disappeared entirely. Her colleagues tried to include her in their usual activities, inviting her to join them for lunch or after-work gatherings. But Sarah consistently declined, making excuses about being too busy or too tired. The truth was that she couldn't bear the thought of sitting in a group where her scar would be the elephant in the room, where conversations might awkwardly pause as people tried not to stare. One afternoon, while organizing supply reports in her office, Sarah overheard two junior enlisted soldiers talking in the hallway outside her door. One of them mentioned seeing her in the cafeteria and wondered aloud what had happened to her face. The other soldier's response was kind, suggesting they should mind their own business, but the damage was done. Sarah's worst fears were confirmed. People were talking about her, analyzing her appearance, treating her like a curiosity rather than a person. That evening, Sarah called her mother and broke down crying for the first time since the accident. She confessed that she felt like a ghost of her former self, that she didn't know how to be around people anymore, and that she was considering leaving the military altogether. Her mother listened patiently, offering words of love and encouragement, but Sarah felt more alone than ever. The isolation began to affect her work performance. Tasks that should have taken hours stretched into days as Sarah found herself distracted by her own thoughts and fears. She second-guessed every interaction with her colleagues, analyzing their facial expressions and tone of voice for signs of discomfort or pity. The simple act of walking down a hallway became an ordeal as she imagined everyone staring at her scar. Sleep became elusive as Sarah's mind raced with worries about her future. She wondered if she would ever feel normal again, if she would spend the rest of her life hiding from the world, defined not by her accomplishments or character, but by a piece of metal that had changed her life in an instant. The dreams she had once harbored of military leadership and service to her country seemed impossibly far away, replaced by a daily struggle just to exist in her own skin. 3 months into her return to duty, Sarah's self-imposed isolation had become so complete that she barely spoke to anyone beyond what was absolutely necessary for work. She had perfected the art of making herself invisible, arriving early to avoid crowds, taking lunch at off-peak hours, and leaving as soon as her shift ended. The vibrant young woman who had once been the heart of every group had effectively disappeared. Her supervisor, Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, began to notice the change in Sarah's behavior and work quality. During their weekly one-on-one meetings, he tried to draw her out, asking about her adjustment back to active duty and whether she needed any additional support. Sarah's responses were always polite but minimal, giving no indication of the internal struggle she faced every day. The breaking point came during a mandatory all-hands meeting in the base auditorium. Sarah had no choice but to attend, and she carefully selected a seat in the back corner where she hoped to remain unnoticed. As the room filled with hundreds of soldiers, she felt increasingly anxious about being in such a large crowd. Her heart raced as she imagined all those eyes potentially turning toward her. Halfway through the presentation, a technical difficulty forced a break in the proceedings. As people began to mill around and chat, Sarah felt overwhelmed by the noise and movement. She noticed several people glancing in her direction, though they were probably just looking around the room randomly. To Sarah's heightened sensitivity, every glance felt like a spotlight on her scar. Unable to bear it any longer, Sarah abruptly stood and made her way toward the exit. In her haste to escape, she accidentally bumped into a refreshment table, sending coffee cups clattering to the floor. The noise drew even more attention, and Sarah felt hundreds of eyes turn toward her as she fled the auditorium. She ran to the nearest restroom and locked herself in a stall, crying quietly as she tried to calm her racing heart. That evening, Sarah seriously considered submitting her resignation papers. She had convinced herself that she would never be able to function normally in the military environment again. The thought of facing her colleagues the next day after her public breakdown filled her with dread. She spent hours composing and deleting resignation letters, unable to bring herself to officially end the career she had once loved. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to Sarah's office. Master Sergeant Patricia Thompson, a woman Sarah had admired from afar, knocked on her door and asked if they could talk. Sarah reluctantly agreed, assuming she was about to be reprimanded for her behavior at the meeting. Instead, Sergeant Thompson closed the door and sat down across from Sarah's desk with a gentle expression. What followed was a conversation that would begin to change everything for Sarah. Sergeant Thompson rolled up her sleeve to reveal extensive burn scars covering her forearm and hand, the result of an explosion during her deployment overseas 5 years earlier. She spoke quietly about her own struggles with visible injuries, the shame she had felt, and the isolation she had imposed on herself during her recovery. As Sarah listened in amazement, Sergeant Thompson described feelings and experiences that mirrored her own exactly: the hyper-awareness of people's reactions, the constant self-consciousness, the way a simple trip to the grocery store could become an ordeal when strangers stared. For the first time since her accident, Sarah realized she wasn't alone in her struggle. Sergeant Thompson explained that she had noticed Sarah's withdrawal and recognized the signs of someone struggling with visible injuries. She shared that it had taken her nearly 2 years to feel comfortable in her own skin again, and that the journey back to confidence was neither quick nor easy. But she emphasized that it was possible, and that hiding from the world wasn't the answer. The conversation lasted over an hour, with Sarah finally opening up about her fears and frustrations for the first time since returning to duty. Sergeant Thompson listened without judgment, occasionally nodding in understanding or sharing similar experiences from her own recovery. When their meeting ended, Sarah felt a tiny spark of hope that had been missing for months. Sergeant Thompson's visit marked the beginning of a slow but steady transformation in Sarah's life. The older woman became an unofficial mentor, checking in regularly and sharing practical strategies for dealing with the challenges of visible injuries. She introduced Sarah to a small support group of military personnel who had experienced similar struggles, giving her a safe space to discuss her feelings without judgment. The support group met once a week in a quiet conference room on base. Sarah was nervous about her first meeting, worried about how she would be perceived by others who also carried visible reminders of their service. But as she listened to their stories, she realized that each person in that room understood her experience in ways that her well-meaning friends and family simply couldn't. There was Marcus, a young corporal who had lost 2 fingers in a training accident and struggled with feelings of inadequacy. Jennifer, a staff sergeant with severe facial burns from an IED explosion, spoke about learning to date again after her injury. Robert, a veteran who walked with a pronounced limp, shared his journey from anger and resentment to acceptance and pride in his service. Each story resonated with Sarah, but it was their collective strength that impressed her most. These weren't people to be pitied or hidden away. They were proud service members who had found ways to thrive despite their challenges. Slowly, Sarah began to see possibilities for her own future that she had thought were lost forever. With encouragement from the group, Sarah started taking small steps toward rebuilding her confidence. She began eating lunch in the main cafeteria again, choosing a table near the window where natural light made her feel less self-conscious. When colleagues invited her to join conversations, she accepted more often, focusing on contributing meaningfully rather than worrying about their reactions to her appearance. The real test came when Sarah was assigned to lead a presentation for new recruits about military logistics. Her initial instinct was to decline, citing her inexperience with public speaking. But Sergeant Thompson challenged her to consider whether she was really unqualified or simply afraid. After days of internal debate, Sarah accepted the assignment. Preparing for the presentation became an exercise in confronting her fears. Sarah practiced extensively, not just the content but also her physical presence and confidence. She learned to make eye contact with her audience and speak clearly despite her self-consciousness. The support group helped her prepare by role-playing difficult scenarios and offering encouragement. The day of the presentation arrived, and Sarah felt her familiar anxiety rising as she set up her materials in front of 30 new recruits. Her heart pounded as the young soldiers filed in, some barely older than she had been when she first enlisted. For a moment, she considered making an excuse and leaving, but she thought about Sergeant Thompson's words about not letting fear make decisions for her. As Sarah began speaking, something unexpected happened. Her knowledge and passion for her subject overcame her self-consciousness. She found herself engaging naturally with the audience, answering questions with confidence and even making jokes that earned genuine laughter. The recruits were focused on learning from her expertise, not analyzing her appearance. After the presentation, several recruits approached Sarah with follow-up questions about military logistics and career opportunities. One young woman thanked her for the inspiring presentation and mentioned that she hoped to follow a similar career path. In that moment, Sarah realized that her value as a soldier and leader had nothing to do with her scar. Walking back to her office that afternoon, Sarah felt lighter than she had in months. She had successfully completed a challenging assignment and proven to herself that she could still contribute meaningfully to the military community. The scar was still there, would always be there, but it no longer felt like it defined her entire existence. That evening, Sarah called her mother to share the good news about her presentation. For the first time since the accident, her voice carried genuine excitement and pride. Her mother cried tears of joy, recognizing the return of the confident daughter she had been worried about for so long. Sarah began to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could find her way back to the person she used to be, or perhaps become someone even stronger. The success of her presentation opened new doors for Sarah that she hadn't expected. Word of her expertise and clear communication skills reached the attention of Colonel James Patterson, the base's second-in-command, who was looking for someone to help develop training protocols for new logistics personnel. When Sarah received the assignment, she felt both honored and terrified by the increased responsibility and visibility it would bring. Working directly with senior leadership meant more meetings, more presentations, and more opportunities for her scar to be noticed. But Sarah had learned valuable lessons from her support group about owning her space and focusing on her contributions rather than her appearance. She prepared thoroughly for each interaction, determined to prove herself worthy of the trust being placed in her. Colonel Patterson turned out to be a straightforward man who valued competence above all else. During their first meeting, Sarah noticed him register her scar with a brief glance, but his attention immediately shifted to the documents she had prepared. He asked pointed questions about her recommendations and challenged her thinking in ways that reminded Sarah why she had fallen in love with military service in the first place. As weeks passed, Sarah found herself becoming increasingly confident in professional settings. She spoke up in meetings, offered innovative solutions to logistical challenges, and even disagreed respectfully with senior officers when she believed they were overlooking important details. The respect she earned was based entirely on her merit, and she began to understand that most people cared far more about her capabilities than her appearance. The real breakthrough came when Sarah was selected to represent the base at a regional military logistics conference. The assignment would require her to present her training protocols to hundreds of military personnel from across the country, including generals and other high-ranking officials. 2 years earlier, before her accident, Sarah would have been thrilled by such an opportunity. Now, despite her growing confidence, the prospect terrified her. Sergeant Thompson and the support group rallied around Sarah as she prepared for the conference. They helped her practice her presentation, offered advice about managing anxiety, and reminded her of how far she had come since those dark early days after her return to duty. Marcus, the corporal who had lost his fingers, shared that he had recently completed his own high-profile assignment and discovered that most people were too focused on their own concerns to scrutinize his injury. The conference was held at a luxury hotel in San Antonio, and Sarah felt overwhelmed by the grandeur of the venue and the caliber of attendees. Military officers in dress uniforms mingled in the lobby, their chests decorated with ribbons and medals that spoke of distinguished careers and important achievements. Sarah found herself questioning whether she belonged in such company. Her presentation was scheduled for the final day of the conference, giving her time to attend other sessions and observe how various speakers handled themselves. She was impressed by the professionalism and expertise on display, but also noticed that many presenters seemed nervous despite their experience. This observation helped normalize her own anxiety and reminded her that everyone, regardless of their appearance or background, faced challenges when speaking publicly. The night before her presentation, Sarah stood in her hotel room mirror, practicing her opening remarks one final time. The scar was still there, still visible, but it no longer dominated her reflection the way it once had. She saw a competent military professional who had overcome significant challenges and had valuable knowledge to share with her colleagues. As she prepared for bed, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The accident had changed her life in ways she never could have imagined, but perhaps not entirely for the worse. She had discovered inner strength she didn't know she possessed, found a community of supporters who understood her struggles, and learned that true confidence came from within rather than from external validation. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but Sarah felt ready to face them. She had stopped hiding from the world and started engaging with it again. The woman who would take the stage the next day was different from the confident young recruit who had first enlisted, but she was no less valuable or capable. In many ways, she was stronger, having been tested by adversity and emerged with greater wisdom and empathy for others facing their own battles. The morning of Sarah's presentation dawned clear and bright, and she woke with a surprising sense of calm. She had done everything possible to prepare, and now it was time to trust in her abilities and the support system that had carried her this far. As she dressed in her crisp uniform, Sarah made a conscious decision to forego the heavy makeup she had once used to camouflage her scar. It was time to present herself authentically. The conference auditorium was packed with military personnel of every rank and specialty. Sarah felt the familiar flutter of nerves as she was introduced, but as she walked to the podium, she focused on the message she wanted to convey, rather than the faces in the audience. Her presentation on innovative logistics training protocols was the culmination of months of research and development, and she was genuinely excited to share her findings. As Sarah began speaking, her nervousness gradually transformed into enthusiasm. The audience was engaged and responsive, asking thoughtful questions and taking notes on her recommendations. She found herself enjoying the interaction, drawing on her natural teaching abilities to make complex concepts accessible to officers from diverse backgrounds. For 45 minutes, Sarah was completely in her element, confident and compelling. The applause that followed her presentation was warm and sustained, but what happened next would become the defining moment of Sarah's journey back to self-acceptance. As she gathered her materials from the podium, she noticed a commotion near the back of the auditorium. The crowd was parting to make way for someone moving toward the front, and Sarah looked up to see a man in dress uniform with stars on his shoulders approaching the stage. General Robert Hayes, the conference's keynote speaker and one of the most respected leaders in the military logistics community, had risen from his front row seat and was walking directly toward Sarah. The auditorium fell silent as hundreds of officers watched this unexpected interaction unfold. Sarah's heart began racing as she wondered if she had somehow made a mistake in her presentation. When General Hayes reached the stage, he stopped directly in front of Sarah and came to attention. What followed was a moment that would be burned into Sarah's memory forever. The general, one of the highest-ranking officers present, rendered a perfect military salute to Sarah, a junior officer with a visible scar who had once hidden in shame from the world. The auditorium erupted in applause as Sarah returned the salute, her eyes filling with tears she was too proud to let fall. General Hayes then shook her hand and spoke words that would stay with her for the rest of her career. He told her that her presentation was one of the finest he had seen in his 30 years of service, and that her innovative approaches to training would benefit countless soldiers in the years to come. As Sarah walked off the stage, she was surrounded by fellow officers offering congratulations and asking for copies of her materials. Several senior leaders requested follow-up meetings to discuss implementing her protocols at their own installations. The woman who had once hidden from professional gatherings was now being sought out as an expert and leader in her field. Later that evening, at the conference's closing reception, Sarah found herself in conversations with colonels and generals who treated her as an equal and valued colleague. Her scar was visible under the bright lights of the ballroom, but nobody seemed to notice or care. They were interested in her ideas, her experience, and her perspective on improving military readiness and efficiency. When Sarah returned to her base the following week, news of her success had preceded her. Colonel Patterson congratulated her on representing the installation with such distinction, and even soldiers who barely knew her stopped to acknowledge her achievement. The woman who had once dreaded walking through the base corridors now moved with quiet confidence, knowing that she had earned her place through merit and dedication. Years later, Sarah would rise through the ranks to become a senior logistics officer herself, mentoring countless soldiers who faced their own challenges and setbacks. She would establish programs to support military personnel dealing with visible injuries, drawing on her own experience to help others find their way back to confidence and purpose. The scar remained, faded but still present, a reminder not of shame but of resilience, and the strength that comes from facing one's fears. The general's salute had been more than a gesture of respect for her professional achievement. It was recognition of her courage in refusing to let adversity define her limits, acknowledgement of her worth as a soldier and leader, and validation that true strength comes not from perfection, but from the ability to overcome imperfection with grace and determination. Sarah had learned that honor is not diminished by scars, but often enhanced by the courage it takes to bear them with dignity.